tell us a little bit more about the region and what its demographic shifts have looked like over the past 15, 20 years. But equally importantly, to help us think about what is the implication of that for planning? What is the implication for what we're planning to do when we graduate, for who we teach, for what we teach, and for the way we teach it, and even the language that we teach it in. So let me take a moment to introduce to you Dr. Nguyen, who is an associate professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, originally from California, who grew up around immigrants and the whole kind of issues around migration in the U.S. and California, who has been working on immigration issues in North Carolina for, sounds like about 7 years, 8 years, something like that. And it sounds like he's got a manuscript somewhere in there about this. So please help me welcome Maya to our department, and we'd love to hear what she has to say.
But today I'm going to give a little bit of a broader overview of the context of global immigration and focusing on the South, and particularly on North Carolina. So on April 20th, 2006, if you were in North Carolina, in any of the cities of Burlington or Chapel Hill, Charlotte, Columbia, Durham, Huntersville, Lenoir, Lumberton, Raleigh, or Wilmington, something big was happening. If you wanted to get a meal at a restaurant or a room at a hotel, you were probably out of luck, because many of the Latino cooks and cleaners and those working in the service industry were not at their jobs. What they were actually doing on that day was that they were joining together on the streets in these cities and marching and protesting what was being proposed in Congress, a legislative reform, what was considered to be comprehensive immigration reform. And it was probably one of the biggest social movements over immigration reform ever in this country, because not only was this happening in North Carolina, but in hundreds of cities all over the country. Happened because of those marches? Well, not much has happened in terms of Congress. In fact, they've been sitting on the fence, just like this cartoon has said. As a consequence of this inaction, President Obama took action on his own. He made an executive action just recently, actually, in November of 2014. He announced that he was going to do what is in his power to do, which is to tell the various agencies that addressed immigration to do a number of things, primarily the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And he told them to stop illegal immigration at the border, so stricter enforcement at the border, to actually focus on deporting felons instead of families. So in his administration, there have been more deportations of Latinos and really immigrants than in any other administration. So reprioritizing who to actually deport, and also to say that unauthorized immigrants need to have a background check, and also to pay taxes if they are to stay in this country. So he's taking his own action because of Congress's inaction. But at the local level, local jurisdictions since 2006 have also taken on, tried to address immigration issues on their own. Some cities have gone in the direction of creating sanctuary cities, publicly saying they welcome immigrants, whether documented or undocumented, and changing policies and practices to actually help to integrate them. Just to give you an example of that, the city of Durham, where I live, said, we are not going to ask for a driver's license if you are looking for public services. And in fact, we'll actually accept a matricular consular, which is an identification in Mexico, as a form of identification. So they're actually changing the way they practice and do business on a day-to-day basis to to integrate immigrants into their communities. On the other hand, some local jurisdictions are actually creating punitive policies or creating a culture that is hostile towards immigrant settlement. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So the big change actually from 2006 is that because of Congress governments have become increasingly involved in immigration. What does this mean for the South? So just kind of taking a step backwards. In the last few decades, the South has seen unprecedented levels of immigration. So when you look at, and it all started around the 1990s, really, because there were very low levels of immigration as well as few Hispanics living in some parts of the South. In the 1990s, North Carolina, Georgia, and Atlanta had among the highest growth in the Latino population, with North Carolina reporting a 394% increase during that decade. South Carolina wasn't far behind. It had also high Latino population growth at 211. So all these are in southern states. The only non-southern state is Nevada that had also a large increase in the Latino population. So you can see that the concentration of where Latinos are going in the 1990s is the South. And because these are percentage increases, a main driver of that is that there were few Latino immigrants in the South, in these states in the South prior to the 1990s. So what's different about contemporary Latino migration to the South? Well, I call this disruptive demographics. They're really disrupting trends trends and patterns of growth and development demographics. So why is contemporary Latino migration to the South different? Well, it's a new destination. The South is typically, except for Florida, not a traditional port of entry. Los Angeles, New York, those are traditional ports of entry. And so very little history of Latino migration or settlement in these places. They're also moving to much different places, a variety of different places, from small towns to suburbs to cities. And they're really changing the fabric of these communities. And I'll talk all about each of these in more detail in a minute. They're also moving to places that have had traditionally a racial history that is primarily black and white. And so adding in this now large group of Latinos is changing the racial dynamics in these states, these southern states. They also have a big fiscal impact, and it's localized. And that's primarily what local jurisdictions are responding to. It's not the only thing. But because immigrants impact local jurisdictions when they concentrate, it has impacts on schools, health services, and also public safety. And then there's a large portion of the Latino population that's unauthorized. And that poses also additional challenges to communities and to states. So just to give you an example, there has been some estimates as to the percentage of undocumented immigrants in North Carolina. And in the 1990s, the estimate was about 50%. This is in contrast to California, which has a very large Latino population, but their estimated unauthorized Latino population is about 24%. So big differences in the number of unauthorized immigrants. So what does it mean to be a new destination state or a new destination place for immigrants? Well, this is just the population growth of Latinos in North Carolina. So in 1970, you can see there that the population was about 43,000, not very many. And then even up to 1990, the increases were marginal, right? A 31% increase in 1980, a 35% increase in 1990. But between 1990 and 2000, a 393 or 94% increase. And then continued growth since 2010, it's about 800%. And now North Carolina has the 11th largest Latino population in the country, of any state in the country. And how does this play out in these new destination places? I'll tell a story about Alamance County. Alamance County is sort of in the middle of the state. It provides some insight into how a place with very little history of Latino settlement responded to this population growth. So Latino migrants, primarily Mexican migrants, started arriving in Alamance County in the 1970s as migrant farm workers. The picture on the right over there of a Latino migrant surrounded by tobacco leaves. And immigration emerged as a pretty divisive issue in local politics in Alamance County. Several local officials pushed an agenda to halt immigration to the county, claiming that immigrants were a fiscal drain on public services and public infrastructure, and that they were trafficking drugs into the county. So, for example, county commissioners voted 4-1 to create an illegal alien task force in 1995 to investigate how the county could curb illegal immigration. In 1997, commissioners unanimously approved a resolution to recommend a moratorium on immigration. Now, they didn't just say unauthorized immigration, they said all immigration. So this was merely symbolic and really not legally enforceable. Right. In 2002, Sheriff Terry Johnson was elected for his first term as Alamance Sheriff with the promises to reduce crime and unauthorized immigration. Soon after his election, his department raided the DMV and arrested more than 100 Latinos on charges of using forged documents to acquire driver's licenses. In 2003, the Alamance County built a new jail so that they could be a detention center for unauthorized immigrants in the region. And they created these detention spaces so that they could reduce the number of undocumented immigrants, not just in Alamance, but all over the state. And they also believed that this was an important revenue generating resource because the federal government would reimburse them for any bed space that was used by an undocumented immigrant. So there was a financial incentive to fill the jails with undocumented immigrants. Then the Alamance County Commissioners adopted or passed a resolution to adopt the 287G program, a program that allows sheriffs, when they bring in prisoners into the jails, to detect, detain, and deport undocumented immigrants. So if they bring an individual into the jail, they can check their immigration status, and if they're undocumented, they can actually start the process of deportation. And they implemented that in 2007. And this is what one county commissioner said here. So you can see the dual role that they express in terms of this program, this 287G program. The 287G program deters local crime by illegal aliens, but that's not the only thing I'm after. I want illegal aliens, to be honest with you, out of here. I don't blink an eye. While elected officials claim that their primary motivation was to fight crime among this unauthorized immigrant population, they were also motivated by reducing the number of Latinos in Latino migration and settlement in Alamance. But they took it too far. They actually used this program to racially profile Latinos and to use the program in ways that it wasn't intended to do. And this is a quote here from a Latina female, which shows how the program was abused. I was standing behind the counter, and a police officer came into my store and asked to see identification. I told him I did not need to provide a driver's license if I was not driving. So he waited outside until I finished my shift and got into my car to go home, and then
They're not allowed to do that. They're supposed to only check if somebody comes into the jail, the county jail. You're not supposed to ask for documentation or identification out in the field. And you're not supposed to do this, which is wait for somebody to get into their car and then ask for identification. So as you can see here, the program was abused. And it created huge distrust of law enforcement because word gets around in immigrant communities very quickly.
Walking instead because they don't have licenses, or they just stop coming, which is terrible for my business. Do you know how vulnerable people are now? I had a customer last week who was walking here, and her 3 little kids, and got mugged by a car that pulled up to them. She had nowhere to go. She didn't have any money left to buy bread by the time she got here. Did she report the crime to the police? Of course not. So this really highlights what some of the consequences are of a program like this. One, immigrants become more vulnerable because criminals know that they won't report to the police. Crime doesn't get reported, and so crime occurs but doesn't get reported. And what ended up happening, actually, interestingly enough, is that the sheriff's office said, look, actually once we implemented this program, crime was reduced significantly. What they didn't know was that the immigrant community stopped reporting crime. And so that was one side result of this program. So ultimately, the Department of Justice came in. I mean, these were egregious violations, and they happened over and over and over again. And the Department of Justice was called in actually to investigate these abuses, and it conducted a 2-year investigation in which they found egregious violations of racial profiling and also abuses of the program. They stripped Alamance County of their rights to have the 287G program, and also Secure Communities, which is the program that came out of the 287G, which is very similar. But what happened was that law enforcement officials with these new powers actually created confusion among law enforcement officials. You know, they couldn't separate their primary roles of protecting the public and fighting crime and addressing public safety with their role as immigration agents. And so they took it too far as being an immigration agent and were unable to really manage these dualities in these roles.
I think that this is an extreme case of what happened in North Carolina, but in fact this happened in a number of other places. I would say 8 other jurisdictions that adopted the 287G program. Very similar things happened in these jurisdictions. So to put it mildly, Alabama didn't respond very well to these changing demographics. In terms of place and space, moving to these new destinations also changed the built environment. They actually renovated old buildings, old historic buildings, revitalized old downtowns in old manufacturing towns. And they also diversified the social and physical spaces in many of these towns. Siler City is a good example of this. Siler City, North Carolina, which is just south of UNC Chapel Hill, where I'm from, about 30 minutes away. Before 1990, Siler City was a small town really reminiscent of Mayberry in the Andy Griffith Show. It had 5,000 people living there, and predominantly blacks and whites. And everybody knew one another. They've had a century of history living in Siler City. And so in the 1990s, when a chicken processing plant came into town, what also came to town was a lot of Latinos working in that chicken processing plant. So by 2000, the population had grown to about 8,000, and over 50% of the population was Latino. So within that short period of time, there were very few Latinos, and then within 10 years, 50% of the population. So as you could probably imagine, there were lots of racial and ethnic tensions. There was growing pains, but ultimately they've sort of worked them out. You know, you can see in this picture here on the top right, a Latino soccer team that they started. They didn't have a soccer team in Siler City at the high school before the 1990s. And so where there was only football fields and baseball fields, now they have a soccer field where they have a soccer team called Los Jets. Not the Jets, but Los Jets. And at first, this is a really interesting story, but there wasn't a lot of support for Los Jets. They actually had things thrown on the field when they played, people booing them, and they weren't very good at first. But after 3 seasons, they actually won the state championship. And that brought with it a lot of change, and people changed their perspective about having a soccer team. Traditionally hasn't really supported soccer. But there are also Latino small businesses that help to revitalize the deteriorating downtown. Latino dancers taking part in a festival at the Catholic Church, a Catholic church that now has a Spanish-speaking mass and lots of Spanish-speaking congregants. So the churches have changed dramatically. And then there are services now provided. A nonprofit developed, the Hispanic Liaison, provides services and also a voice for the Latinos. They've been large advocates of addressing punitive policies against immigrants and Latinos, and have been really successful in changing some perspectives in the local elected officials. So Siler City is an interesting case study to show how place and space are dramatically impacted by rapid Latino population growth. And then the third thing I want to talk about is the relationship between blacks, whites, and Latinos. Really, the rapid influx of Latinos to some of these communities has made these communities renegotiate their boundaries of race and ethnicity. How do Latinos fit into a place where it's been predominantly blacks and whites, and predominantly the power structure has been blacks and whites, right? And it's unclear, and it's different. It's such a new phenomenon that I think that different communities are working it out in different ways. So I'll just talk a little bit about Durham, North Carolina, where it's been a majority-minority city for a while now. But in the last 20 years, there's been a rapid influx of Hispanics. The population is about 280,000, and it's predominantly an urban county, and Durham is a big city where most people live in the city limits. There's a study conducted by some faculty over at Duke University to look at attitudes of whites, Latinos, and blacks. So these are attitudes of whites and Latinos towards each other. So how positively they feel about one another, or how negatively they feel. So the yellow bar is very or somewhat negative. The blue bar is neutral, and the reddish bar is very or somewhat positive. Okay. In Durham, where the Latinos actually settle is in historically black neighborhoods. And so they have more interaction, more competition, maybe more tension as this Latino population is growing very rapidly and taking up space in their communities. Whereas, and if you look at patterns of segregation, Latinos are not necessarily living near whites. So there might be some also role of residential segregation and where Latinos locate. The fiscal impacts. Fourth is the fiscal impacts. So although immigration is a global issue, the reasons why immigrants come to places like North Carolina are related to global economic factors and migration patterns. The impact often is local. And so when you hear local elected officials say that they are concerned about immigration because of its impact, it's because they have to pay the costs. Often it's the local jurisdiction and the state that pays for schools, health services, and public safety. Well, there was There's a study conducted by our business school to look at the economic consequences of Hispanics to the state of North Carolina. Do they cost us more? Do they contribute more? What is it, right? Because the conversation has always been they're very costly and they cost us a lot and they're draining our resources and they're impacting our public infrastructure. But there was no real quantitative data to back that up. And so the business school actually did a study in both 2004 and 2014, so we've done it twice now, to look at the economic impact of immigrants, and particularly Latino immigrants. And they looked at things on the cost side, the big cost factors, K through 12 education, health services, public safety. And on the contribution side, they look at things like personal income and property taxes, direct consumer taxes, and then how they indirectly impact businesses and taxes. And then they subtract out things like remittances that immigrants, in particular Latino immigrants, send back to their own country, right? And what they find is that there's the net per capita impact is actually a net benefit of about $12,300. That there's for every dollar the state of North Carolina spends on essential services to Latinos contribute $6 in revenue to the state, in the state. And so the business school found that there's a net benefit to the state of having Latino immigrants. And you can imagine that, yes, they may cost the schools, the local schools, a lot of money, and they, but they also spend a lot of money in the state. So I think that when you look at it on different scales, some jurisdictions might be paying a lot for Latino immigrants in the short term. When you look at it statewide, the impact is huge. Their spending power is around $9 billion in the state, and the impact has been tremendous. What about unauthorized immigrants? Unauthorized immigrants, if you believe the business school report, that it's estimated at 50% of the population, of the Latino population, that poses additional challenges. All these things that I've already talked about, when you add on that 50% of the population that I'm talking about, it doesn't have legal documentation to be in the country, can't vote, can't do a lot of things. It can't get a driver's license because you need 4 forms of identification in North Carolina. So interestingly enough, before the 1990s, it was really easy to get a driver's license in North Carolina, and that's partly why unauthorized immigrants came to North Carolina. When they started cracking down, they made it very, very difficult. And by the time I got there, you needed 4 forms of identification to get a driver's license. So Social Security card, a bill with your name on it, and I think blood from your firstborn child. I mean, it was ridiculously difficult. And so undocumented immigrants can't get driver's licenses, which makes their lives very, very difficult. And oftentimes, they live in the shadows because they can't contribute, they can't participate in civic activities, and they can't do things that all of us can do. And so the challenges, I won't go into detail about all the different ways in which undocumented immigration is challenging, both at the state and the national level, but there's a number of different ways in which undocumented immigration challenges government. It challenges them in terms of enforcement. How do they enforce undocumented immigration? How do they identify people who are in their communities if they don't have documentation, if they don't have identification? How do you address labor issues? How do you deal with firms and businesses who benefit from undocumented immigration, undocumented labor? How do you have the resources to crack down on it? They've tried to raid Smithfield. It's a meat processing plant, one of the biggest in the pork processing plants in the country. I think now China owns them. Actually, China purchased Smithfield. And it's very difficult to do. The government just doesn't have the resources to do it. And then, actually dealing with criminal activities among the undocumented population is also difficult. So undocumented immigration and large numbers of undocumented immigrants do pose real challenges to communities. This is all to say that also Latino immigrants and immigrants in general also provide a lot of opportunities for places and for states like North Carolina. So this is a study conducted by Dow Myers at USC, and he and his colleague, Joel Pitkin, looked at Latino immigration or integration in the US. And they looked at a variety of different indicators of integration. They looked at income, they looked at home ownership, they looked at English proficiency, high school completion, citizenship rates, whether or not people worked in professional jobs, and college completion. These are all really traditional indicators of whether or not immigrants have integrated into U.S. society. And they look at young children and track them over time. So young children who immigrate, who are foreign born, move to the U.S. at a very young age, typically under 5. This is what sometimes people refer to as the 1.5 generation. They look at whether or not how they fare over time. And what they find is that between 1990 and 2008, even recent immigrants do very well in terms of integration. Their income rates skyrocket. Their home ownership rates are very high. English proficiency also does fairly well. So on some measures of integration, they actually integrate fairly quickly and well into the U.S. Society and economy. Then when you look at second generation, so the children of immigrants, right? My children, for example, by the time they're 35 years and older, they pretty much they very closely resemble native-born U.S. children. Okay? So, they have 84% high school completion rates, 21% hold a BA, 32% have higher paying occupations, 92% of households live above the poverty line, and 71% are homeowners. And nearly 100% of them have mastered the English language. So this idea that immigrants don't integrate or they're resistant to integration has not played out in many of the studies that have been conducted on the second generation. When you look at all of the studies, I've done a large literature review on second generation immigrants and integration. What you find is consistent results. The second generation are pretty much integrated at a level that closely approximates native-born Americans. Their economic impact. This comes from the UNC Business School study. Their economic impact to southern states, particularly in North Carolina, is tremendous. Latino buying power is $9.5 billion. Their overall economic impact is $10.3 billion. Their consumer spending is responsible for 92,000 spin-off jobs, right? So the economic impact is a net gain for the state of North Carolina, and it's huge. So where does that leave us? We've heard over and over again that it'll be a majority-minority population in the U.S. by 2050, right? And Latinos will represent 29% of that population. And I think that the path that we're going, the policies that we implement today, what we do to integrate immigrants can have an impact on how the trajectory of Latinos in the future. There are some that think that there's this downward assimilation, that are punitive policies, things like not allowing undocumented immigrants to pay in-state tuition rates to go to college, thereby limiting the ability for them to afford college, will have a negative impact. right? Not allowing undocumented immigrants to have a path to citizenship will have them continuing to live in this segmented, separate society. And that it might lead to this downward assimilation, right? Where there's increased poverty, there's lack of job mobility, that they live in segregated spaces, and segregated neighborhoods, and segregated lives, and that they don't participate in U.S. life. Now, this isn't a choice that Latinos make, but rather the barriers they face to actual integration. And as I showed in terms of looking at second-generation immigrants and also young children who immigrate here, they actually do fairly well in terms of integrating. But I think that the policies that we have today will impact whether or not those trends will continue. And then there's some that believe that there's this path to upward mobility. If we can pass good, comprehensive immigration reform that allows individuals a path to citizenship, allows them to work, allows their children to go to college, that immigrants, and particularly Latino immigrants, will see economic mobility, will see home ownership rates increase, and will be more integrated into U.S. society. But I think that this is all dependent, a lot of this is dependent on what we do with immigration policy in the next decade or so. And so I'll leave you with this, that integration is a two-way road, that immigrants integrate into the receiving society, but there's much that the receiving society can do to accelerate that integration, to actually create a path so that immigrants can become productive and successful parts of our community. So I'll go ahead and end it there and take any questions that you have.
Do you think the legalization test, of course in Spanish, would be a fair way to offer them citizenship? The legalization test, like the U.S. history?
Yeah, I mean, I think, sure, I think that would help. I mean, if it's about just knowing the history and understanding U.S. policies and practices, having it in another language could certainly help get more people to be naturalized. But I just don't, that sort of goes against our ideas of becoming American or being naturalized American.
What would you suggest as opposed to the test for citizenship?
Oh, what's another alternative to the test for citizenship?
Yeah.
You know, I haven't really thought much about the test. So I took the test to become a naturalized citizen. It's not really a test. It's you sit down and it depends on who your interviewee is and what country you're from, and the questions are derived from what country you're from. So since I'm from Vietnam, a communist country, all of my questions were around communism. It's not really a test. So first and foremost, I'd probably change the test or whatever they call the test. So I don't know enough about the testing and what their rationale for the testing is, but I don't think it's very systematic or, yeah, I'll say that, yeah.
I have two questions.
Yes.
So you talked about job opportunities, but also laws, for example, in North Carolina, before they made the changes, that were a little bit easier to get a license, things like that. You know, out of those two or even other options, what was the main catalyst for the boom in the 90s? And then my second question would be on the receiving community end, what are some more local measures, you know, you could take for, I guess, municipalities to kind of make it a more inviting environment for immigrants?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the first one is, why did immigrants move to North Carolina in the 1990s? Why the boom? And there are a variety of reasons. The economy was certainly a big driver. There were jobs there, particularly in sectors where you didn't have to have a lot of education.
So some people call these low-skilled jobs. I actually don't call them low-skilled jobs because, you know, I can't do electricity, and I can't. These are pretty technical jobs that require actually some training. I have colleagues actually in my department that study skills, and they went to Mexico to see what, you know, what types of training Mexican construction workers get, and they actually get a significant amount of training in both carpentry and and electricity. I mean, they get sort of a well-rounded education, whereas here we're very specialized. So it's a misnomer to call them low-skilled, but anyways, the jobs that they came to do, they were actually very well qualified to do. So meat processing, construction, agriculture are the big three. Textiles, manufacturing also. And then your second question related to, remind me again.
Well, kind of what local government can do.
Oh, what
to be
local
more
governments can do. That's a good question.
inclusive.
There are lots of things. So when we worked with 3 local jurisdictions to actually work through an immigrant integration process to make the community more welcoming, there's very kind of low-hanging fruit, things that you can do, translating material into different languages, having representatives of these groups in local government or advisory boards, inviting them, outreach, things that would get them involved. And then there's other things like changing policies, accepting different forms of identification, health agencies accepting payment plans instead of credit cards. So there's lots of different ways that people on the front lines, these service organizations, these have been changing their practices to actually adapt to a different type of clientele. And that makes them feel very welcome to schools, having everything. So when my kids go to school, everything is translated into Spanish. Every phone call is both English and Spanish that I receive from the schools. So just, I think incorporating your practices, or changing your practices to make immigrants feel as if they're welcomed and wanted.
Yeah, too. I wondered if you could say a little bit more when you brought up the business school study that said that there was a net positive economic impact. Then you mentioned that there are some issues of matching some of the income with some of the benefits at different scales and things. And it seems like,
Yes.
with particular respect to the schools, where a lot of the burden is going to fall on the schools, but if a lot of the revenue is generated through spending, sales tax is going to go somewhere else. So could you say a little bit more about those conflicts and whether there are any state initiatives to address some of those conflicts?
Yes. So that's right. There are winners and losers, right, in terms of the fiscal costs.
Yeah.
So businesses that have cheap labor, they benefit from immigration. Schools, actually, it costs a lot of money to have new ESL classes, to hire teachers, to train teachers to deal with this new population. And so they've actually been pretty resistant to having more immigration and have been very vocal about it. There hasn't been statewide initiatives to actually address this. Particularly, the state has actually been pretty anti-immigrant in North Carolina. Most of their policies have been to reduce the level of immigration and not to actually address what's actually happening. So that's why it's so contentious, is that there are different parties that benefit and other parties that pay for immigration.
And I have one other thing,
Yes.
just really quickly, which is, has anyone looked at, I know, because I come from the University of Illinois, where Faranac Talk has done a lot of research similarly on this, but looking at Midwestern communities, which also actually rely on a lot of the ag processing and have the same groups coming in, and has looked a lot at those, the newer Latino population integrating into what were traditionally all white communities.
Mm-hmm.
And has there been any comparative work looking at the differences with respect to your box on the right there, receiving community, the differences between one with the historic white-black divide and one with the all-white?
I have not seen anything like that, but that's a really interesting research topic that I think could actually be pretty fruitful.
Do any of the businesses that actually employ immigrants and make profits from them, do any of them advocate for
No.
decent treatment and better integration? Or they really treat them sort of just as a labor force for them and that's it?
They actually don't want to raise attention, right? They don't want the federal government to know that they are hiring unauthorized immigrants or are not checking the documentation very well. So no, it's very hard to get big business to actually advocate for better labor force practices, better environments, or even changing federal policy so that immigrants can come here legally. We've tried to talk to business entities, and they're just not there yet.
They would be pretty powerful.
Yeah.
But they don't see it
They don't
necessarily,
see benefit.
they don't see their issues, because their wages pressures would go up.
Yeah.
Well, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, though, 2013 is usually pretty conservative, but with that movement 2 summers ago, they're actually pushing really hard for like a legal path. I mean,
Yeah, I'm speaking mostly in North Carolina, but you're right. I mean, at the national level, there's certainly other business organizations.
Well, it would appear that the private sector that does the approving and the local, state, and federal government that turn the eye the other way are complicit in this clandestine practice of, well, I don't even call it indentured servants. So.
Yeah, I think that's true. That I mean, it's a hard issue to crack down on, but they've also not done enough to actually address the issue.
Can you speak to the fact that Bank of America started offering credit cards, and they're housed in, Charlotte as their headquarters, and they were offering credit cards, I want to say about 8 or 9 years ago to illegal immigrants, and they're one of the few banking institutions that have supported them even without IDs.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I should point out that yeah, they might not verbally, publicly support it, but businesses who actually benefit from consumer spending have been actually at the forefront of helping to integrate immigrants. So Bank of America, for example. So undocumented immigrants can still get an ITIN number, which is a tax identification number, and it sort of functions as a pseudo-social security number. You can get lots of different things. You can buy a house, and that's why home ownership rates are so high, even among undocumented. You can buy a house with an ITIN. You can buy cars. You can get a bank account. You can get a credit card. So you're right. I mean, all of things like banks and car dealerships and the mortgage industry have been very receptive. And they will take money as long as it's green. It doesn't really matter that it's from undocumented immigrants. So that has been helpful. So there are ways in which they can participate, at least in the economy, and purchase consumer goods.
I'm also wondering if you're seeing any differentiation between different states in the Southeast in their reception of illegal immigrants. I mean, are there any patterns in levels of acceptance?
I would say there's a bigger difference in local jurisdictions, and that it's very uneven. I think there are very few southern states that have rapid Latino immigration and rapid immigration that have really been progressive in terms of saying we are going to, be receptive and open to immigration. I haven't seen that in the rapidly growing southern states.
We're just talking about sort of large and small businesses taking advantage of this new market in consumer spending. One of the interesting things is actually that minorities spend a disproportionate amount of their investments in real estate. If you look at the assets by race and ethnicity, by far, minorities have way more assets than whites in real estate. Now, being sort of part of a department that has a real estate development program, one of the natural things that comes to my mind, who's targeting that? Are the developers targeting real estate asset investments in this growth area? Is it something that you've seen in North Carolina or elsewhere? In the same way that Bank of America is trying to serve this growing community.
That's an interesting question, and one that's actually being studied right now. The Latino Credit Union in Durham came to me and said, we want to know more about Latinos and why they don't buy more houses. A lot of them live in mobile homes. A lot of them live in apartments. And we want to know what the barriers are to home ownership, because it's a fairly new group, right? Some of them moved there in the 1990s as maybe young men or have young families, and now they're aging to the point where they should be buying homes. And so there's not a lot of knowledge about real numbers around this. But I will say developers are probably the most key, right? They're kind of on the forefront of understanding the markets.
Yeah.
And what they have been building are apartments.
Yeah.
A lot of apartments. I wouldn't say they're catering towards the homeownership market quite yet, because I think that there isn't that big market for it yet. But there's certainly apartments. Since the recession it's picked up, the economy's picked up now, there are thousands and thousands of apartment complexes in and around main cities in North Carolina. And a lot of it is targeted towards a Latino population. Yeah, that's growing. Any other questions? Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.